Temos a honra de passar a palavra agora ao indiano Gurpreet Singhota, Diretor adjunto da Divisão de Segurança Marítima da Organização Marítima Internacional, IMO, e secretário do Subcomitê de Segurança da Navegação NAVE, com responsabilidade sobre os comitês NAVE e CONSAR. Gurpreet Singhota é capitão de longo curso, com 14 anos de experiência de mar, é também mestre em ciência pela Cranfield University da Inglaterra. Capitão Singhota, ao qual peço desculpas pela pronúncia se eu tiver errado o nome, ele vai expor uma visão geral das orientações da Organização, das orientações da Organização Marítima Internacional, incluindo resoluções e regras sobre a praticagem. Por favor.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, distinguished participants. First and foremost, I would like to thank the President of the Brazilian Pilots Association, Mr. Ricardo, and Admiral Ricardo. It's a privilege and honor for IMO to be present here today, and on behalf of the Secretary General of IMO, I wish to thank the Brazilian Pilots Association for inviting IMO to be here. Before I start, I think I have to follow the tradition that has been set and tell you my age. Mr. Almeida said he was 20 years old, and Captain Mike Watson was a little truthful. He said he's 23 years old. But I'm going to tell you the absolute truth, I'm only 16 years old. So anyway, what I'm going to tell you is about the guidance IMO has developed over the years about pilotage. So basically we go back to 1967 when we first had an assembly resolution or recommendation on pilot ladders. It was just what should be the quality and equipment for pilot ladders for fishing vessels. But the real recommendation was on pilotage that came out of Resolution 8159 in 27th of November 1968, so that's a long time back, nearly 45 years back. And what that resolution says is it recommends governments should, the operative word is should, organize pilotage services in those areas where such services will contribute to the safety of navigation in a more effective way than other possible measures. And where applicable, define the ships or classes of ships for which employment of a pilot would be mandatory. So that was the first assembly resolution that came out of IMO. Then we go on to November 1973, we had an assembly resolution 8263, and in parentheses is the numeral number 8, which is the 8th assembly. And it adopted an amendment to Regulation 517 on pilot ladders and mechanical pilot hoists and invited governments concerned to accept them at the earliest possible date. And in parallel with that, we had a resolution 8275, which was recommendation on performance standards for mechanical pilot hoists. Then as we go further, we had at the 9th Assembly, Resolution 8332, recommendation on arrangements for embarking and disembarking pilots in very large ships. That's the time we really started getting serious. The size of ships was beginning to increase. And it recommended that all vessels where the distance from the sea level to the point of access of the ship at any time exceeds 9 meters should also carry an accommodation ladder on each side so that it could facilitate the boarding of the pilot. Then there is a whole series of resolutions that were adopted by IMO. The first one was Resolution 826, and this one revoked resolution, the previous one I mentioned, 332, and this was in November 1979. And then of course, at the 12th Assembly, we adopted a very important Assembly resolution, which is training and qualifications and operational procedures for maritime pilots other than deep sea pilots. And this was adopted in November 1981. And then we had resolution A6716 on pilot transfer arrangements 8 years later. And then in 1999, 10 years later, we had a new assembly resolution which revoked all the previous resolutions I mentioned. And then finally, we have the resolution A10527 on pilot transfer arrangements, which revoked even the previous one, 82921. Because at that time, we also adopted, as I show you further on, amendments to SOLAS Chapter 5. So this is the main assembly resolution. It's A962023. It's been mentioned before. It talks about recommendations on training and certification and on the operational procedures for maritime pilots other than deep sea pilots. And this resolution, as I mentioned earlier, revoked resolution 48512. And in its preambular paragraphs, it states that this resolution has got 2 annexes, and it urges governments to give effect to these recommendations as soon as possible, and requests the Maritime Safety Committee, which is the apex technical body of IMO, to keep the recommendation under review and to amend them as necessary in the light of experience gained from their implementation. So basically, it was a period of 22 years from 485 to 960-23. And this was a very well debated and well thought out assembly resolution. We had quite a few discussions on this in the NAB and the STW subcommittee, and it's the best possible consensus that emerged at IMO. And my fellow speaker, you will see here in the later on in the day, Mr. Paul Kachner from IMPA. He would also explain a little bit more in detail about that resolution. He was the chairman of the drafting group, and I think he merits some appreciation, I think a lot of appreciation for managing such a difficult task. And this resolution adopted 2 recommendations, Annex 1 and Annex 2. Annex 1 talks about recommendations on training and certification of maritime pilots other than deep sea pilots. And point 2, which is Annex 2, is recommendation on operational procedures for maritime pilots other than deep sea pilots. So it sets out the recommendations by IMO to member governments on how to set up pilotage authority and how to train pilots. Annex 1, it talks about the scope. The government should encourage the establishment or maintenance of competent pilotage authorities to administer safe and efficient pilotage systems. If you look at all our IMO assembly resolutions, they are using the operative word should. So it's a recommendatory. Isn't the word shall is not used. Shall is a word that's used in the convention text. So that's obligatory. Talks about competent pilotage authority. It says that every government should establish a competent pilotage authority. And what does it mean? It means either the national or regional governments or local groups or organizations that by law or tradition administer or provide a pilotage system. And it is the duty of the government to inform competent pilotage authorities of the provisions of this document and to encourage their implementation. The assessment of the experience, qualifications, and suitability of an applicant for certification or licensing is the responsibility of the pilotage authority, competent pilotage. The resolution goes on to list what the competent pilotage authority should do. It should establish the entry requirements, develop the standard for obtaining a certificate or license, enforce the maintenance of developed standards, specify whatever prerequisites, experience, or examinations are necessary to ensure that the applicants for certification or licensing as pilots are properly trained and qualified. And also arrange that reports on investigation of incidents are available and they are taken into account in the maritime training of pilots. Then it talks about pilotage certificate or license. That means every pilot should hold an appropriate pilotage certificate or license issued by the competent pilotage authority. And in addition, it should state for which area the license is valid. Then it talks about the medical fitness. Each pilot should satisfy the competent pilotage authority, that his or her medical fitness is fine, and it meets the requirements under the STCW convention. And if the pilot has suffered an injury or illness, he should be re-examined to make sure that he meets the fitness standards before he returns to duty. Then again, the competent pilotage authority. So it's always the competent pilotage authority that has got all the responsibilities to make sure that the training and certification or licensing standards are maintained. The pilot should be trained in bridge resource management, and competent pilotage authorities should be encouraged to provide updating and refresher training. So that means once the pilot gets his license, it's necessary that retraining should go on, refresher courses should be undertaken. And the continued proficiency is a must. And then in the Annex 1, there is a syllabus for pilotage certification or licensing. I haven't listed it here. I'm given to understand by the president of Conapra that copies of Resolution A 960-23 are available in Portuguese and English outside the conference hall. So I encourage distinguished delegates to take copies so they have a better overview of the requirements. Annex 2, this is the second annex, it talks about recommendation on operational procedures for maritime pilots other than deep sea pilots. It sets out in general that what are the guidelines, and it says that effective coordination between the pilot, the master, and the bridge personnel is very necessary for a safe pilotage operation. It details the duties of master, bridge officers, and the pilot. And of course, the golden rule, it's always master's orders and pilot's advice. It doesn't absolve the master of any of his responsibilities if there's an accident. Talks about pilotage, boarding point, and it's up to the competent pilotage authority that they should establish and promulgate the location of safe pilotage embarkation points. I know they're given on charts, but the responsibilities of the competent pilotage authority to inform the concerned hydrographic officers that is put there on the chart, but the information is available to ship owners, people using the boat. Then there are procedures for requesting a pilot. The competent pilotage authority should establish, promulgate, and maintain procedures for requesting a pilot for an inbound or outbound ship, and for shifting a ship within a port area. And of course, ETAs and expected time of departures should be furnished to the pilotage authorities as soon as possible. This is a very vital point, master pilot information exchange. It's been discussed many times in the IMO forums, subcommittees, and STW, and even NAV subcommittee. And it's very, very important that the master and the pilot, they exchange information to ensure safe pilotage. And it says at the start of the pilotage, the master and the pilot should exchange information regarding navigational procedures, local conditions and rules, and the ship's characteristics. I know the ship's handling characteristics are displayed on the bridge as a requirement, turning circle, everything, but there could have been deficiencies during the voyage. Any piece of equipment is not functioning, it's the duty of the master to tell that to the pilot. And then it's very important, the communications language. We have multinational crews. Maybe there was a time when countries had national shipping companies, that was not a big problem, but now it's a real issue. And resolution stresses that pilots should be familiar with the IMO standard marine communication phrases. It's an assembly resolution, and it's a book also available from IMO publications. And then it goes on to say that communications on board between the pilot and bridge-keeping personnel should be conducted in the English language or in a language other than English that is common to all those involved in the operation. In case there is an accident, the pilot should report any incident or accident that has occurred during the pilotage process. And then there is the refusal of pilotage services. The pilot should have the right to refuse pilotage on the ship. In his opinion, is considered to be a danger to the environment or safety of navigation. And of course, there should be a solid basis or a good reason for giving this refusal. And then there's the obligation on pilots to be fit for duty. That was the assembly resolution, but there are also SOLAS regulations that are concerned with pilotage. The first one is SOLAS Regulation 523 on pilot transfer arrangements that was adopted with MSC 8 on 3rd December 2010 and it entered into force last year in July, 1st July. And there is SOLAS Regulation 2-139. It's about the accommodation ladders to facilitate embarkation and disembarkation from ships. This was adopted in May 2008 and it entered into force in 1 January 2010. There is a footnote to this regulation in Resolution 1047 on pilot transfer arrangements. There are also relevant MSC circulars which gives guidance to administration and to pilotage authorities regarding pilot transfer arrangements. In terms of hierarchy, it is assembly resolutions are on top, then comes MSC circulars, and then comes safety of navigation and other circulars. So there are 3 circulars, MSC.1 on safety of pilot transfer arrangements, and then MSC.1 Circ 1428 on required boarding arrangements for pilots. And I understand that a copy of that circular is also in the publication that's available outside the conference hall. And then there is MSC.1 Circ 1331 on guidelines for construction, installation, maintenance, and inspection of means of embarkation and disembarkation. This correlates to SOLAS Regulation 2.1, which is cross-referenced to Resolution 1047. MSC.1 Circ 1402 is very important. It talks about safety of pilot transfer arrangements. And it's being recognized its importance because the MSC, if you read, says encourage member governments to formally include pilot transfer arrangements as a part of the safety equipment that their port state control officers would be examining. So we recognize that the safety of pilots is paramount and it should form part of that post-state control inspection process. Conclusions. As you see, from 1967 onwards, IMO has developed sufficient and detailed guidance for pilotage matters. We have kept the process under review, and as and when we have received concerns from member governments that there is a need to review certain guidance, we have gone ahead and we have done it. But the process has not been haphazard. For example, this resolution 960 was revised after nearly 22 years. So it's not changed overnight. The guidance has been amended, updated as required to meet the new regulatory regime as SOLAS Chapter 5 Regulation Change 523, we revised the Assembly resolution also. In this task, IMO has been assisted at every stage of this process very constructively by IMPA, and I must put on record the excellent relationship IMO has developed over the years with IMPA. In fact, all observer organizations have worked very closely on pilotage issues with IMPA. Of course, I want to conclude by saying that implementation of IMO guidance is the prerogative of national governments, but it's very important that member governments take into account the recommendations given in Regulation 960/2023. And thank you very much.